South Africa and Egypt between them consume about half of all of the energy in all of Africa. If you take out these outliers, the big energy users, South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, these are mostly fossil-based and, put them to one side. But if you look at the rest of Africa, which is almost 1 billion people, they are consuming very little and they're emitting very little, and nobody should lose sleep over what they do. This is not where the problem is.
Africa, the sunshine continent, and yet it only has 1% of the world's solar energy. Cloudy Germany has more than the entire continent. But that might be set to change. There was a huge rise in solar panel imports last year from China. So this week, our climate question is, can solar power Africa's future? I'm your host, Greer Jackson. In the studio, we have the climate questions, Jordan Dunbar.
Hi, Greer.
And Dr. Rose Matiso.
Hi there.
It's great to have you back on the show, Rose.
I'm very glad to be back.
Rose is the science advisor for the Energy for Growth Hub and the founder of the African Tech Futures Lab. So you know a lot about energy, renewables, and also how that all intersects in Africa.
Yeah, that's what I've been working on and thinking about for over a decade now, so I'm excited to talk about it.
So let's jump in. I know around half of Africa doesn't have access to electricity today. What sort of impact does that have?
The impact is so multi-layered, and I think one way to think about it, which is the most relatable, is just imagine living in darkness, right? And so people in their homes, when night falls, you don't have lights. You also don't have modern amenities. You can't charge your phone. You don't have an air conditioner when it's hot. You don't have a refrigerator. So everything that, enables our modern lives is connected to electricity. So at a kind of individual level and a household level, so often actually in the space we think in terms of households, that is a very kind of diminished life in terms of joining a modern lifestyle. But then you cannot power productive centers in your economy. So factories, office buildings, just everything, and going up to electric trains, just a lot of the infrastructure of modern life that kind of produces the stuff we use that gives us jobs and incomes is tied to electricity. And so that is the even bigger part of that gap, which is hugely impactful. So both at the individual level and at the household level, but as just economy-wide, you're living in kind of very diminished circumstances.
So when we're hearing about more solar power on the continent, it's not just about reducing carbon emissions, which is something we talk about a lot, but this is genuinely transformational. Can you talk us through some of the projects, like high level, low level, that you've seen to make us understand how transformational they can be?
On one level, what we're seeing in rural households especially, or households that are in poor parts of cities that are not connected to the grid, is you can now have these really small solar panels. And so there are companies that are selling what are called pico solar units. So pico to mean quite small.
How big would that be?
Yeah,
the size of A4 or?
Yes, so actually even smaller. So it depends. So if you think, people might have experienced some of these going camping. So if you think of a solar lantern that you might have going camping, and there's a little window of a panel. Yeah, there's a little window of a solar panel that could be the size of a phone or smaller, up to something that could look like an A4 that goes on an A4 sheet that goes on your roof. And then to maybe, the size of a monitor, a computer monitor, depending on what kind of service you're getting. And so the really small ones can power a single light. You can get a little bit bigger and you can have some mobile charging plus some lights, slightly bigger. So we're talking about 25 to 50 watt peak, still 1,000 times smaller than what you would have to power a house in the UK or the US or EU. But with about 25 to 50 watts, you might be able to get a really efficient LED TV hooked up in addition to your lights. So that's having a big impact for people in underserved areas.
How expensive are they? Can you give me a sense of is that a day's wages?
Yeah, more. So basically $10 or so, which is huge if you're a poor person living on $1 a day. And so often there are off-grid companies that are in the market. There's Greenlight Planet, D-Light, they all have different names. There's some bigger and smaller ones, but they have to, the most successful ones have to offer financing. And so even that $10, $20, or whatever solar lantern, people are buying it on credit, on financing, because they're so poor. So that's different from utility scale solar. So this is what, people are often thinking about these like arrays of solar panels that you might see in,
Like a solar farm.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we call utility scale. And those are, megawatt. So another 1,000 bigger than what you would have on your house if you are in the UK. And then the solar farms, the big stuff is just, and so that's where you have real economies of scale. And this is where solar's affordability is really shining. And so you can build these solar farms that are much cheaper than building a big legacy coal plant. And you hook these up to the grid, and they're just part of your grid mix. And so when you kind of flick your light, some of those electrons are coming from a solar farm. And so we're seeing much more installations at scale in Africa of solar energy. You also need your grid to be able to accept these electrons. So you need to build, wires and transmission and distribution infrastructure and that kind of thing and manage the whole grid. But all of this is happening, and it's part of the energy mix, and it's exciting, but we're still in early days. So sometimes people get overexcited.
Yeah, I was going to say, the stat I've seen is that Africa is this big sunshine continent, has 60% of the world's energy, solar energy, could be captured in this place. And yet only 1% of the world's solar panels. What is going on? Why are there so few solar panels when there is so much potential for it?
Africa is receiving a small fraction of total clean energy investment every year, still in that single-digit percentage of total clean energy investment. And that investment is what pays for solar panels and wind farms and whatnot. So already it's just not an investment destination, not just for clean energy, but just in general. People are not sure if they're going to get their money back because of, currency volatility, political risk. Yeah. And so this all goes into what kind of terms you can get, and you need investment. And you need lending to build these. And this is another thing about solar, wind. These are hugely capital investment.
Okay, Rose, I'm going to put you in the spot here. Give me 3 things that would really help scale up solar power across the continent.
Well, one is make it easier for people to get investment into Africa. So we just need to kind of unclog the clogs, the kind of the cogs of finance. Second thing is technical bottlenecks. So better grids, better technical capacity, like at every level. So the grid needs to be more sophisticated and more stronger so it can absorb all of these kind of diverse energy sources. You need trained installers.
Electricians.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like there's a technical bottleneck that is working on very many levels and scales here. And then I think the last one that not enough people really talk about is demand, because it's a chicken and egg. And one demand is just you need people using energy to create a market for energy. You see? And so this is like a big problem in Africa where if you overbuild and you invest in, then you just have a lot of white elephants, right? And
so they're not making money?
Yeah, they're not making money because the kind of the supply, the generation needs to meet kind of hand in glove the demand. And that's where we need industrial policy, right? So we need to create sources of demand. Like in some countries, like Kenya has this big agro processing plank in the industrial strategy. So Kenya exports tea, coffee, horticultural flowers. A lot of the flowers in the UK come from Kenya. So, but all of those that kind of existing agricultural industry, if you do more value add things, you're processing more things locally. That's an energy intensive activity, which means you created demand for energy, and which makes these projects viable. And by the way, you've created jobs. And so people like kind of starting to think of energy demand as this super important thing, which like, how can we create more uses of energy in this country? And I think sometimes for like people in Western countries or people who are like thinking a lot about climate and the environment, that seems perverse because I'm saying we need to create more ways for people to use energy. That seems backwards because it's like, oh, isn't energy what got us into this problem in the first place? But the point here is that, energy is what kind of creates all the value in our society, so it underpins it, right? And it's true that in some segments of the kind of rich end of the global economy, people are overusing energy. Like in the US, I think each household uses like, orders of magnitude more than the average kind of African household. So that's different. But the point is, like, in Africa, where you have such suppressed demand, you have such underconsumption. This is a symptom of the fact that we don't have productive economies. This is a symptom that we are not producing, we're not building, we're not making.
Yeah, which is why I think some people in Africa really feel that fossil fuels are a good alternative, because the technology is here, right? People have whole economies, rich economies have developed off the back of fossil fuels. There is a huge reserve of them in Africa. I think I was reading 8 to 9% of the world's oil and gas is in Africa, right? So why wouldn't businesses, governments just rely on that?
It is true that mature, fossil generation, whether it's, natural gas plants, whatever, these are mature technologies. We know how to do them. If you are an African country that has those endowments, that has those supply chains already ready to go, then it makes sense for you to build that infrastructure because you have pressing development needs. At the same time, you're still not breaking the climate because you're such a small
Well, that's what I was gonna say, because I was saying to Jordan before we started the show that even if Africa burnt all its gas reserves, it would still only contribute 1% of the world's CO2 emissions. And for comparison, the US has admitted 25% since the late 1800s of all CO2 emissions. So it's such a tiny amount.
And this is why I love talking about Africa and energy and climate, because there is no conflict. South Africa and Egypt, between them, consume about half of all of the energy in all of Africa.
Right.
So these are huge economies, huge power producers, huge power consumers. So if you take out these outliers, and obviously, like South Africa, the big energy users, South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, these are mostly fossil based, and put them to one side. But if you look at the rest of Africa, which is like almost 1 billion people, they are consuming very little and they're emitting very little, and nobody should lose sleep over what they do. This is not where the problem is. It doesn't mean you don't have to care about sustainability, but it's a different consideration. It's, I want to build, if I'm going to put all this upfront investment, I want to build an energy system of the future. The climate anxiety with Africa is just, for the most part, there's not much to be anxious about in the short to midterm. So putting that aside, if you have a fossil endowment and you have the supply chains that you need to, then, and you're meeting pressing development needs, that's fine. Part of the challenge, though, is because people have taken this oversimplified. They're like, well, we should just build fossil fuel, whatever, because why are you forcing solar panels on us? The truth is, there are distributional effects. So, a country like Kenya or Ethiopia, or, we don't have natural gas endowments. We don't have pipelines. We don't have a way to, we would have to build so much infrastructure to kind of get like a natural gas system going, because it's not part of our system. There's a lot of, we'd have to have import terminals and this and pipelines and whatever. And this is, we don't have like a natural gas.
You have to get a company in to come and do that.
Yeah.
And there have been allegations around sort of wrongdoings around that.
Yeah.
Right?
And just in general, and this is what we try to, like my colleagues and I try to really encourage people, is just to try and look at everything, not in the abstract. So don't make abstract claims like solar is a silver bullet, or let's just do fossils. And, Westerners stop telling us to do those. Those are kind of like sweeping statements that are compelling at the level of rhetoric. But it's just like, let's come out of that abstract.
Let's focus on the grey area. I'm very much a greyer area kind of person.
Exactly. Oh, there we go.
On optimism, there's often an argument that solar is part of this idea of like leapfrogging technology. So going from, for instance, mobile phones, instead of having a landline, many developing world countries just went straight to mobile phone and smartphone. It doesn't sound like solar is a complete leapfrog. That you wouldn't just go straight to solar. It wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because, and this is where like the mobile phone example is the canonical leapfrogging example, and it works. It's great, but it's been a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it's great that we have mobile phones. So thank you to the creators of mobile phones. And it's kind of displaced. It's made unnecessary building like telephone lines, obsolete infrastructure, and the impact of mobile telephony in Africa and the world is huge. So that's great. The challenge with that example is that it's not generalizable, right? And so people like to say, oh well, we went Africa didn't have to build landlines and they went to mobile phones, so we don't have to build a grid. We can just have
Solar
solar.
panels.
And so then the analogy kind of falls apart because, there are ways in which solar is a leapfrog and there are ways in which it's not. And it also depends on the application use case. So, for example, the example we've talked about a few times in this discussion, which is if your rural home off the grid in darkness using candles and you now have a solar light, that is a leapfrog, right? You didn't have to wait for a grid, a transmission line to a distribution line to a transformer to come to a wire to your house. You didn't have to wait. That is a leapfrog, but that's different from can we have an entire economy-wide energy system that is all solar with nothing else and no other energy sources, no grid infrastructure, no interconnections, so that is where then the leapfrogging analogy falls apart. And the other thing about solar, then you need, because it's variable and all of these different challenges, you need other leapfrogs to make it work. And so we have to create this storage leapfrog.
So batteries.
Batteries. Those technologies are still evolving. So solar is not a standalone. It has to be seen in the context of the whole network. When I was kind of thinking about this episode and thinking about how I've spent the past decade and a half living in am I in the solar revolution or am I not? I was looking at numbers about African kind of power mix numbers. I was just revisiting them. And, in the countries that have really high renewable energy shares, so 80% plus, of which there are, a dozen or so in Africa. So think Kenya, Ethiopia, Mozambique, DRC, Namibia. Vast majority of that is hydro. And so when people are talking about green generation on the continent, actually in the world, hydro is the backbone. And it doesn't get enough airtime because a lot of the discourse is focused on wind and solar, but actually hydro is a workhorse of green generation in the world. Kenya is interesting. In Africa, we have geothermal and hydro that make the backbone, but Ethiopia, all of these other countries, just hydro is what is greening our grids. And so I think it's just important when we are thinking about what is our goal. Our goal is green energy. Then that is a much bigger solution space than just solar.
I've actually been to Kenya and to the geothermal plants that you're describing. And Jordan, I think you'll really like this, and I'm sure you'll know about this too, Rose, because I was really blown away by this. So we were getting a tour of a big geothermal plant in the middle of, I think it was near Lake Naivasha.
Yes,
in a national
Naivasha,
park.
that's a big, Olkaria is a big complex.
Olkaria, thank you. It was quite a long time ago that I went. And so and there were loads of pipes everywhere, piping hot water, right? But because they go through a national park, they need to make sure that the animals can get past the pipes. And for giraffes especially, so they have these huge U-bends that go really high in the air and then back down again so that giraffes can travel through.
And this is one of the quirks of Kenya is that our big geothermal complex is in the middle of a national park. And it has pluses and minuses, but you can literally, it's called Hell's Gate National Park, and you can ride your bike in it because they claim that there are no carnivores, there are no lions. This is what is claimed. Suspiciously, there are a lot of zebras and you know what I mean, but apparently no lions. But you can actually ride your bike. You can do bike tours. You can hike in this national park, and you can hike among the geothermal pipes that are moving the steam around. So it's kind of this really unique shared space by animals, people who are hiking, walking, riding bikes, and the geothermal
There are
plants.
no... So the other great fact, and I'm sorry, the other great fact though, you're saying there's no lions, but that very famous scene in The Lion King where Simba falls down this gorge.
Great. Are you taking...
Runs,
Is the Lion King your reference?
This is based in a gorge in Hell's Gate National Park. And now you're saying there's no lions.
Let's just assume that Disney took some liberties with the facts.
It's a documentary.
It's real.
Including they're speaking South African languages, not Kenyan languages. They really mix it up. But so this is one of the kind of the quirks in Kenya is that there are places like in Hell's Gate National Park, and the reason you can hike and walk and ride your bike is that they're not supposed to be any apex predators apparently. But I often think to myself, if I was a lion, where would I want to be? Here, where there are humans and zebras and giraffes. And so I know this is what is claimed.
Our climate question for this episode, Rose, was could solar power Africa? And what would that mean for Africans, but also for the rest of the world?
So, yes and no. So, yes, in that solar is going to be a transformative force in Africa and in the world, and especially in Africa where we have so much potential for solar. It's just like a resource that's there for, our taking in many ways. But the no part comes in because you kind of have an energy mix, one that is, you need diversity in your energy mix. And so there'll have to be a suite of energy sources. And the greener and the cleaner, the better. The cheaper and more affordable and scalable, the better. And also, depending on where you are within countries across the continent, your ability to kind of lean on solar will really vary, including your ability to balance it and back it up. So in some countries like Kenya, actually hydro and geothermal are our kind of help us balance our resource. And even then we still have challenges. And if you're in Senegal, probably for now you have to balance it out with natural gas while you're waiting for batteries to become quite scalable and affordable. So the kind of, in short, solar is huge. It's important. It's revolutionizing so much about our energy systems, but it's one in a suite of solutions, and the balance of kind of how much solar is dominating your energy mix will depend on where you are and other factors.
Dr. Rose Matiso and Jordan Dunbar, thank you so much for joining me on The Climate Question.
This was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
If you have a climate question, you can comment it below or email us. It's theclimatequestion@bbc.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing. I've been Greer Jackson, and hopefully we'll see you next time.